If the politicians think they had difficulty summarising an hour in 3 minutes, I've got 2 days to summarise in the
10 minutes.
I thought I had 15. We I suppose the first thing we've got to be reminded of is the scale of informal cities. 1/6 of the world's population lives in informal and illegal cities. 1/6 of the world's population. It means not only are they living in illegal houses without legal tenure, they can't access water, they can't access sanitation, they can't get their kids into schools, they don't get health care. In many cities, if you don't have a legal address, you don't get on the voters' register. In many cities, if you don't have a legal address, you don't get your kids into school. You can't use the local hospital. We still think of most of Africa and Asia as rural. Africa has a larger urban population than North America. Africa has a larger urban population than North America. This is being ignored by most aid agencies. The record of aid agencies in urban areas is pretty poor. My own government, DFID's aid agency, doesn't work in urban areas. However, the indices of deprivation amongst poor urban populations are often as bad or worse than rural areas. Kibera, 15% of children born in Kibera do not survive their 5th birthday. Kibera is within spitting distance of sewers, of drains, of mains water. It isn't a lack of infrastructure that explains that. It's a deliberate political choice not to service. The most exciting thing for me in these 2 days is that for once it wasn't the blah blah professionals and professors like me that dominated, but it was people like Evelyn, Schaefer, Ruby, Winnie, Rose and many more. The people that told us what was needed were the people that formed the community-based organisations, the grassroots organisations, the grassroots federations. For once it wasn't a professional-dominated agenda. Looking into the future and drawing from all the recommendations that were made by the open space discussions, I will list a few that were repeated endlessly. The enormous possibilities of upgrading informal settlements, upgrading illegal settlements, if governments work with the inhabitants. And again, we've got some good examples, some strong examples, some amazing examples. The need for affordable legal land sites for housing. Informal cities exist because the formal land market provides no opportunity for 1/6 of the world's population to get land on which to build a home, on which to get tenure, on which to get the guarantee they won't be evicted. And again, we got so many examples. We've heard many of them today. More and more grassroots organisations that can negotiate for land and can build their homes and demonstrate to local governments, to national governments, to international agencies their capacity. Of course, the issue is not only around sites for housing, but also for public space, for semi-public space, for space that is used and maintained and loved and cherished and protected by community organisations. Space for infants, space for young children, space for older children, spaces for adults, spaces for everyone. Again, grassroots organisations have demonstrated ways to manage public space. The importance of disaster prevention was mentioned so often, and we know the reason why. The increase in deaths and injuries in urban areas from disasters has been catastrophic in the last 30 years. 95% of the deaths from disasters in urban areas are amongst poor groups. Now, usually, when I get the chance to talk to an aid agency or to the politicians that work with an aid agency, I harangue them. It means I don't get many invitations. For CEDA, I don't need to do that. CEDA's urban programme recognised the scale of urban poverty 20 years ago. It recognised that it needed to work with city governments and with grassroots organisations, as well as national governments. It recognised the need to engage with those that lived in informal settlements, including federations of the urban poor. CEDA is one of the only official aid agencies in the world that has looked for ways of funding the federations of the urban poor. And CEDA's example over the last 20 years has been hugely important for making other agencies rethink their policies and their practices. We hope that CEDA will continue to lead on this, to innovate on this, especially to work out the ways in which it can fund city governments and grassroots organisations direct. And of course, if you work with the federations represented here, if you work with the federations, you're also working with local governments, because they've developed those partnerships. 4 strong recommendations came out of the documents that were given to me. But we have to innovate on funding for grassroots organisations. Most bilateral agencies are incapable of funding grassroots organisations. And it's got to be funding at the pace that they want. One of the worst things is to give them too much money. One of the worst things is, if they're negotiating political changes, why haven't you spent your money in year 1 as you promised? Of course, you ought to applaud them for actually using your money better and making it go further and not necessarily spending it quickly. I know the accountants, my institute's accountants included, are horrified at this. But urban poor organisations need funds they can draw on as and when they need them, to avoid using them when they don't need them. And then to come to you to say we want to triple the funding because the government has agreed to give us 1,000 plots. The second, of course, is to support the inhabitants of these informal cities, work with each other, learn from each other, visit each other, learn from each other's successes. One of the amazing things about the federations is they take local government officials with them when they travel. So if the Namibian local governments have been responsive to the federation, the South Africans take their local government ministers, or the Kenyans. This is something that needs support. The third is to recognise that the urban poor organisations themselves are the primary role in poverty reduction in urban areas. Joachim Apoortwan, the head of Chapleurs International, made this wonderful comment to the United Nations. At the United Nations, he looked at them and said, "You silly bloody buggers, do you think that you can reduce poverty without us?" I don't think the United Nations representatives had ever been called silly bloody buggers before. The fourth issue. See these informal cities, these shanty towns, as much more than that. They're homes, they're communities, they're markets. Within them you see innovation, you see entrepreneurship, you see culture, you see philanthropy, you see dance, you see music, you see artistry, you see capability. They have a legitimacy, they have a culture, they have rights. It's time for us to recognise that and to work with them. One of the most gorgeous things about the book on Dharavi, produced, that is outside, it isn't full of recommendations. Usually when Westerners visit Dharavi, they come with lots of recommendations, most of which won't work. It came to help document, to see, to listen. Of course, in the recommendations, there was also the need for Sweden and countries like my own, the UK, to adopt examples of how high quality of life is no longer a huge draw on the planetary's ecological resources. So in a sense, to redefine quality of life away from high consumption levels. And the funny thing is that I think in the sessions we listened to, you got the answer to most of your questions. How do you combine top-down and bottom-up? Well, I heard the example of Malawi, where the local government has been pulled into supporting the federation. I hear the example of the Indian Slum Dwellers Federation on the Hill of Milan, where they've persuaded government to work with them. I hear the example in South Africa, where the Minister of Housing, Lindewi Sisulu, gives a personal commitment to support the federations, works with them, listens to them, learns from them. Not many housing ministers take the chance to learn from the poorest people in their groups.
May I have 2 minutes?
Okay. How to make urbanisation positive? One of the questions this morning. Well, I think we've heard a lot of good examples of how to make urbanisation positive. Water is a human right. Who's going to realise water is a human right? It's not us. It's actually organised women's groups saying that we have the right to housing and we'll help you install it and maintain it and manage it. Those are the people that are going to realise that right to housing. Solutions for people, we've heard lots. Democracy has to be formalised. Again, I think we've heard some very strong, powerful examples of that. I think, what's the conclusion for us professionals, for us aid agencies, for us consultants? That we don't recommend what should be done. We begin to understand who needs to define what should be done. In other words, I don't fight for the right to water. I fight for the right of the Homeless People Federation of Malawi or India or South Africa to demand water and sanitation. In a sense, we shift from demanding what should be done to making sure those that live in slums and squatter settlements set the agenda, make the negotiations, and make the demands. That's a tough transition for us to have.
Okay, thank you.